at this event, right? So the Future of Hip Hop Studies panel at Harvard University provided a compelling snapshot of where the discipline is headed, but it also illuminated areas that remain underexplored. The discussion featured professors like Samy Alim from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, also Adam Bradley from UCLA, Regina Bradley. We have two Bradleys here, right? Regina Bradley, who was from Kennesaw State, Mark Anthony Neal, who was from Duke University, and of course, Tricia Rose, who was at Brown University, and the person who released the seminal work, who many believe to have started hip hop studies, Black Noise. This is back in 1994. And collectively, these professors painted a vision for hip hop studies that seeks to scale, remain relevant, continually adapt to cultural shifts. However, as the conversation unfolded, there were certain critical areas of hip hop's evolution and influence that I felt were notably absent from the discussion. Now, in terms of evolving the discipline, I'm going to give you the key takeaways of what I got from each scholar who did present, right? Samy Alim made the opening remarks, and he framed the conversation around the need for hip hop studies to continue to expand in ways that not only engage with artists, but directly also recognize and define the diverse points of contact for which people have with hip hop. His critique of hip hop's multiplicity, of its touch points, was often flattened within academic discourse in terms of it particularly being resonant. Hip hop is not a monolith. And he spoke about acknowledging this fluidity as essential for the discipline's future, right? Adam Bradley extended this argument by proposing a typographic framework for hip hop studies that emphasizes collaboration amongst journalists, artists, educators, entrepreneurs, technologists, and activists. And his emphasis on an updated anthology of rap music's historical and cultural transmission reinforced the idea that hip hop's intellectual and artistic evolution demands continual reassessment. Now, Regina Bradley went a different route. She provided a necessary counterpoint, emphasizing that Southern hip hop, and I emphasize Southern hip hop. You know, she said at the very beginning of her talk that she didn't care about anything but the South, right? She emphasized that Southern hip hop was a gateway to understanding contemporary Black life. And her argument was that Southern hip hop remains academically marginalized, much like Outkast's experience at the 1995 Source Awards. And this underscored the necessity for regional inclusivity in hip hop studies. Now, Mark Anthony Neal's contribution focused on hip hop's role in the broader canon of Black studies. He focused on sonic genealogy, Black remembrance, and bereavement, and framed this through hip hop as a critical site of documentation that scholars should examine with greater rigor. Meanwhile, Tricia Rose, in her closing call to action, reiterated that there's an urgent need for hip hop studies to resist romanticization and corporate co-optation. Her critique of hip hop studies' complicity in capitalist structures and the field's potential stagnation without robust debate highlighted the need for self-reflection. I was totally shocked by the route for which Tricia Rose took, given that she didn't speak for that long, but she seemed to have a real vigor and energy, more so than any of the other speakers at the event. And I think her short kind of call to action really sparked, at least within me, the want to sort of identify some of the blind spots that occur in addition to the way in which she pointed out our unwillingness to sort of call to task those who are actually in the industry, and sort of this divide between those who are practitioners and those who are scholars, meaning those who actually make music and those who just theorize about it, right? And while the panelists made some really significant contributions, I want to make that clear. And I revere the contributions of these scholars in the way in which they inspired me to sort of take the pathway for which I took. But in the spirit of Tricia Rose's sort of call for debate, I wanted to identify where the conversation lacked engagement with some crucial areas that I think will shape the future of hip hop studies. The youthful point of contact, right? Much of hip hop's vibrancy and evolution, it stems from young people, particularly through digital platforms. And there was an absence of youth perspective on the panel. And I believe this was a missed opportunity for those who were more established to engage with the emerging voices that are starting to shape the culture. Um, Secondly, the scholar as a practitioner, which I just sort of referenced, right? Hip hop studies has often been divided between those who study it and those who actively participate in it. And while Adam Bradley, as well as Samy Alim, spoke about partnerships at UCLA that have included artists like Chuck D and Common, the field must be more intentional about integrating scholars who are practitioners, right? Those like Stevie Johnson, Dr. View, or even A.D. Carson, who's at the University of Virginia, and even myself, right? Artists who are producers and cultural workers and scholars that could possibly bridge the gap in the conversation, right? And we also need to have different types of partnerships um, with those who are in the industry, right? So when Tricia is saying like, hey, we can have these partnerships where we invite artists to our classrooms and to our auditoriums, we don't need to just bring them to our campuses to celebrate and have dinners with them and take pictures. We also need to engage with them in terms of the serious debates that we've been having. I had an event here at the University of South Carolina with David Banner that I think kind of served um, in that regard, where I had students that challenged him. I gave him questions that I hoped were challenging to him, but we had a real candid conversation, right? It wasn't just um, me kind of allowing for him being on campus to just be a celebratory moment, but it was an opportunity for us to engage in a spirited conversation that between friends still was critically kind of taking hip hop to task, but then also doing the inner work of recognizing the spaces and pathways for which both he and I had traversed in our careers, and how some of the things that we did in our younger years weren't necessarily aligned or in alignment with the ways in which we feel about the world or the culture today. And knowing that we have to right those wrongs, and also knowing that hip hop is a beautiful struggle full of flawed individuals, and I myself am flawed, and he himself admitting that he was flawed. And I think that's why that conversation went the way that it went, right? The other thing I want to think about is rap separation from hip hop and rap separation from blackness as it's become more popular and more commercialized, right? I think that's been something that's been theorized at nauseum about like this idea that hip hop is solely tied to its cultural roots in African American urban communities, but the panel did not really sufficiently address the implications of the separation that's occurred as hip hop has become pop culture just as much as it's black culture. And what does it mean if hip hop, as we move into Generation Alpha, um, becomes distinct from rap and the rap music industry? And if the rap music industry loses sort of its tentacles within its black cultural origin. Uh, Also, something that I write about very often is hip hop as an aesthetic and as a mindset. This is something I've had conversations with on this podcast and on my YouTube channel. Right. Beyond music, hip hop's a radical way of seeing and engaging with the world. I think this panel missed an opportunity to explore how hip hop as an ethos informs activism, education, and social movements beyond just musical contributions. Um, that said, my work as a media scholar, shameless plug. I felt like I could have been on this panel and contributed much of these ideas, right? And that's neither here nor there. There are other scholars who are in that space too that I think could have contributed in some radical ways to this conversation, especially when we're talking about technological innovation. I'm thinking about someone like Stephen Gamble. I'm thinking about someone like Jasmine Henry, and this idea that hip hop, you know, or even MC Samus, who's also at Brown University, in Nongo. And this idea that hip hop has always been at the cutting edge of technology, whether thinking about turntablism or the drum machine or auto tune or some of the ways in which, uh, you know, hip hop has innovated time and time again as it turns with social media and now AI. I wanted to hear a little bit of conversation about this evolving relationship with tech and how um, AI, streaming algorithms, as well as the digital music economy, uh, as well as sort of this thing called social media entertainment or creator culture, how that sort of fits into the realm of what we call hip hop studies. That said, my work has really been focused lately on the influencer industry as well as creator culture, and I think the internet has spawned an entirely new generation of artists and those who are in the hip hop community of practice who really don't see themselves as needing to be in the hood or on the streets or at the event to participate in the culture. you know, I think that's a thing of the past. It's something that we romanticize. I myself used to do it because it's the way I came of age in this culture and in this thing that I love. But I think the rise of internet rap, meme culture, the decentralization of music distribution, all of these things should be central to conversations about hip hop's future. That said, there also needs to be a reckoning with racial capitalism, right? And the fact that there are new models of entrepreneurship that hip hop has birthed, extending beyond the traditional music industry structures and exploring how hip hop's business innovations can also challenge existing economic paradigms would enrich the field. I recently have taken on a relationship with a brother by the name of James Riley, who was at Harvard Business School. And he's doing something real innovative in that space in terms of his lab called Black Box. And although Black Box isn't central, it doesn't have the central purpose of exploring hip hop, as a means of innovation, it is a part of the lexicon of what that lab is doing and looking at how Black entrepreneurship, Black identity, Black cultural production often is undervaluated, exploited, appropriated, but then subsumed into larger systems of capitalism, right? And I think this newer model or this newer mode that we're thinking about in a world where a lot of technological tools have made it to where individuals can be very independent in the ways in which they sort of seek to build sustainable careers. I think that is something to be explored in terms of how hip hop, you know, I talk about this in Clout Chasers, where I talk about drill rappers, and I also talk about sex workers. But I think drill rappers and sex workers can tell us about the future of work more generally. And I think accepting that type of work into what we consider to be the canon of hip hop studies would definitely enrich the field. That being said, I've talked about how hip hop studies and hip hop based education, hip hop pedagogy, hip hop ed, all of these things have been around for about 3 decades now, or I would say 35 years almost, right? That being said, I think there's a want to romanticize the culture, but also the works that are attached to it. Um, and so, in calling for this like rebirth, which Adam Bradley spoke about, can hip hop experience a renaissance in academia without clinging to nostalgia and the idealism that comes with it? I think addressing the genre's evolution with critical honesty rather than nostalgia is also necessary for moving the field forward. So as I had a conversation with AD Carson recently, which is also going to be, on my channel, on my podcast page as well, very soon. I think we have to be able to get away from, looking at books that were created during a certain time period as being untouchable, in order to move the field forward. And we also have to think about the idea that maybe we might like scholars as people. They may even be our friends. But that should not hold us back from debating and critiquing and analyzing, at sometimes opposing the views for which their publications and their books may take. Um, Also, and I think there's some irony in this because I myself, I have sort of matriculated through a bunch of these institutions, but I think there's a lot of gatekeeping at elite PWIs, and there's an irony of discussing hip hop's future or hip hop studies future, or even the idea of having, a fellowship dedicated to hip hop, which is, an art form that for many years was associated with spaces of poverty and discrimination and, just disenfranchisement, right? Um, to discuss this future within such an institution like a Harvard, and what that then does to what we frame around hip hop studies, where, you know, elite PWI seem to be the only spaces and places that have robust pathways for people to enter into. The gatekeepers at those institutions um, then get to sort of determine what is the future of the field. And so when we're talking about inclusivity, and as it was mentioned in some of these talks, particularly Regina Bradley's talk, I'm wondering, how do we ensure that hip hop studies remains accessible to the communities that created hip hop in the first place, and the scholars that may not have access to a Harvard or may not go to the graduate schools, or the undergraduate programs, or have the formal training academically, period, to enter into certain rooms that sort of shape what the future of hip hop studies might be. There may be a missed opportunity or a blind spot for which there are voices that are valuable but aren't being valued because they aren't going through the right channels. How do we then unearth those projects, unearth those partnerships, unearth those identities that may not be getting the proper fairness or treatment that hip hop typically would lend towards those on those who participate in the side, right? That said, queerness in hip hop is still a big thing that hasn't been wrestled with as well. Homophobia on one end, but then like the romanticization of lesbianism on the other end, right? Despite the increasing visibility of LGBTQ plus artists in hip hop, discussions of queerness in the genre still remain underdeveloped. Hip hop studies has to address this intersection more comprehensively for the discipline to move forward. Um, the role of satire and joy in hip hop is also something that I think uh, is underutilized or under approached. Hip hop isn't just about resistance and struggle. It's about humor. It's about joy. It's about laughter. It's about satire, and explaining how these elements function within hip hop culture would definitely add a necessary dimension to academic discourse. I think this work is already happening, but again, I think there's so much work that has touch points or entry points, as Samy Alim talks about, with hip hop, right? But we don't include it in what we like to call the canon of hip hop studies. So I guess ultimately what I'm saying here is the Future of Hip Hop Studies panel, it provided valuable insights into the trajectory of the field, but it also revealed that there's a lot of gaps that need to be addressed for the discipline to move forward, remain dynamic and inclusive. Moving forward, I think hip hop studies has to embrace the full complexity, engaging with youth, practitioners, technological, to publish. Had some technical difficulties here. I'm gonna restate the last paragraph. So, the Future of Hip Hop Studies panel at Harvard provided valuable insights into the trajectory of the field, but it also reveals some gaps that must be addressed for the discipline to remain dynamic and to move forward. Hip hop studies has to embrace its full complexity, engaging with youth, practitioners, technological shifts, entrepreneurship, queerness, as well as the digital transformations that are shaping hip hop's future. Only by expanding that conversation can hip hop studies continue to be a site of innovation, critique, and cultural preservation. Now, that is the totality of my notes. That is the totality of my take. Um, and in the spirit of those who actually presented at this particular symposium, I urge anyone to talk with me, to engage with me, to even debate with me about these things, because I think the more we have these types of discussions, that are open, honest, and transparent, I think the better things will be. Often there's a lot of jockeying and volleying that happens in certain rooms of academics where junior scholars have to, play the role and not try to pull rank against those who are senior scholars, those who have published more, have more weight and breadth in the room. And I understand hierarchy. I understand um, meritocracy. I understand, uh, the level of minutia that comes along with bureaucracy. However, I think when we're talking about the future, if we're really discussing the future of hip hop studies, then it has to have a balance of power. Um, and we're not speaking about this from a level of gatekeeping or governance or anything like that, but I just think that it's the ideas that come from the graduate students and the junior scholars uh, that are half baked that often are the sparks that light the flame to push the discipline in new directions that it wouldn't have been pushed before. And I think sometimes the politics of a discipline that's already marginalized and has been fought for many of years by certain uh, authors and scholars and practitioners. I think there's a level of stagnation that doesn't equal out to even where the culture in and of itself has moved in a way where hip hop scholarship, to me, at times feels stuck in the late 90s, early 2000s. Um, and the newer works have to reference those works in ways that may be limiting uh, how work gets exposed that could bring forth these new dimensions that I spoke about in terms of some of the gaps that I felt like this conversation might have had. Nonetheless, a valuable conversation was had. And just the fact that I was compelled to come home and make a video like this and kind of distill and give a synopsis of what was said and talked about, I mean, that says a lot. And so I'm hoping that, I can do my own part by having my own conversation about the future as it pertains to how hip hop fits within academia. And I hope others will join me in sort of bringing their perspectives to this conversation. Again, I'm Dr. Jabari Evans. I'm signing out. Uncommon Knowledge. This is a different type of episode, different type of monologue. And I'm going to start experimenting with doing more of these. And so I hope this was helpful to you because it definitely was a helpful vent session for me, a way to get through my office hours. So I thank you, and we'll talk again. Peace.